Hi everyone, so in our last video we started to look at analogous and homologous structures and how this can give us an idea of whether or not a species has a common ancestor or has evolved to be more similar in its function. So in today's video we're going to look at speciation. So this is where we look at divergent evolution, starting with a common ancestor and how that ancestor can accumulate changes over time and eventually become a new species. So an organism that was to mate with the other form of the organism that would give sterile offspring. Okay, so fully new species. And this process we call speciation. So the only learning objective from this video is to be able to outline the steps to the development of new species through natural selection. And there's 3 steps that we're going to look at in detail. So when we talk about speciation, we're talking about the process. Okay, so speciation itself is the process of evolution through natural selection that leads to a new species. Okay, that leads to a new species. So it's the process where one species splits or diverges, so we're talking about divergent evolution, into 2 or more new species. And speciation itself involves 3 steps. The first, which we always have to have for evolution through natural selection, is variation. Then isolation of the population in some way, and then after isolation, natural selection, working on that population to accumulate a different gene frequency over time. When we look at a phylogenetic tree, or basically the family tree of organisms, these forks in the tree highlighted here are where we see speciation events, where we have seen the organism diverge into 2 different species. So we can see here that it diverges here to this branch and then this branch, and then this branch on the left hand side diverges again, okay, into these 2 species, whereas this one has stayed as one. So we don't have the process of speciation acting on this population. So let's look at these in a little more detail. Step 1, of course, is variation. For a new species to occur, there has to be variation in the original species because natural selection is involved. And remember, this is genetic variation, okay, which gives variation in the phenotypes. Okay, so here we have phenotypic variation, okay, which of course is going to come about due to genetic variation, this being from mutation, sexual reproduction, and all the things we talked about in our genetic variation video. So just with any form of evolution, the first step is we have to have variation in a population. The second step is that population, the original population, needs to be isolated, okay? And this is more accurately termed as reproductive isolation, because isolation can be physical in terms of, as we see here, the different clawfish species being isolated by a landmass, with Panama in the way here and us seeing different species on the east versus the western side. It can be through a mountain or a river, but it can also be through mating habits, okay? So this is where we get no flow of genes between the isolated groups, okay? So remember when we talked about genetic variation, we said there was gene flow, the ability for one population to migrate and mate with another. In order for us to see speciation, that gene flow needs to be stopped in some way. So there needs to be something that stops the mating of the different organisms with the variations, so that that can no longer be passed on into the general population. That way, if we get genetic variation through mutation in one group, it can't be passed on to the other group. So they start to become different from the original population. Okay, so this can occur through geographical or climatic barriers or even behavioral. You may remember that we watched the video on David Attenborough and the birds of paradise in New Guinea. They're behavioral adaptations that would stop mating. Remember that if they didn't do a particular dance, then they wouldn't be able to reproduce. So things like changes in mating calls and mating behaviors can mean that the reproductive opportunities are limited for an organism. So once the new population has been isolated and we start to accumulate mutations and genetic variants within that population separated from the original one, of course, now we have new selection pressures acting and we get natural selection. Okay, so the groups are divided and may encounter different selection pressures on one side of that divide to the other. So the isolated groups respond differently to their respective selection agents. We get accumulation of different phenotypes and genotypes. Over time, the gene frequency changes and these genotypes are passed on in one population and not the other. And eventually, after many, 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 many generations, thousands of years, we could see an entirely new species arising. And like when we talked about in our space unit, it's hard for us to conceptualize the exact lengths of time that are involved in this because we are talking thousands to millions of years, which is hard for us to think about when we only live for 80 to 100. So that's it. All you really need to be able to do for speciation is outline the 3 stages, okay, and explain each one. Okay, the first one, of course, is variation, which is the same as variation when we started talking about natural selection. Number 2, which is critical to speciation, is isolation and the different ways that things can be isolated from each other and stopping. Okay, the key point to this is stopping gene flow between populations. Okay, so stopping the gene flow between populations. And then after that has happened, we get natural selection occurring according to the 5 stages of natural selection. Remembering that we have variation in the new population now. Some more of them are produced than will survive. Some adaptations are beneficial, so they are more likely to carry those adaptations on to the next generation. The gene frequency increases over time. Okay, so then you've got the 5 stages of natural selection that kick in here. So we isolate our population after it has variation, and then natural selection kicks in. Here's another quick video that's just 3 and a bit minutes long, which summarizes what we've talked about here. And I'll see you in class.